Now that we understand how trauma affects the brain, let's talk about how trauma can affect student behavior and performances in the school setting. When the brain processes trauma, stress and trauma exposure can impair emotional regulation and executive functioning accessed through executive high-order reasoning. Childhood trauma is associated with higher levels of experiential avoidance. This means most children who experience trauma will act out in schools by seeking to avoid any and all activity related to their past trauma. For students in schools, this means there are likely many instances where inadvertent exposure to trauma-related triggers can result in student behavior challenges, including demonstrating an inability to follow directions, participate in learning opportunities, pay attention, work with others, and challenges with retaining or recalling information. Students who have experienced trauma may instead display challenging behaviors, such as verbal and physical aggression, attendance problems, difficulties in developing and maintaining peer relationships, and deficits in self-regulation. These issues contribute to the prevalence of academic and behavior challenges in schools, often leading to school dropout among adolescents in low-resource, high-crime neighborhoods. Students who live in stressful family environments are more likely to exhibit avoidant behavior, such as running out of class or refusal, and are less likely to engage in problem-focused coping strategies like deep breathing or positive self-talk. Such students who experience severe and ongoing trauma can also have trouble accessing and identifying emotions, coping with emotions, tolerating emotional expression, and will often demonstrate an impaired ability to regulate their impulses. This can lead to difficulty in developing and maintaining peer relationships, responding appropriately to disappointment or failures, and difficulty in identifying the emotion of peers and teachers. For students who have experienced complex trauma, behaviors can also include maintaining a state of hyperarousal or hypervigilance, with a tendency to overreact to stimuli that may go unnoticed by others. This is because their amygdala is often sending warning signals to the brain. Hyperarousal includes symptoms of sleeping, hypervigilance, and irritability. Hyperarousal often extends to conditions that are not necessarily consistent with the trauma that occurred. For example, hyperarousal can include fear, panic, and uncontrolled anger that seems to be disconnected from any observed triggers. At times, it can also be confused with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, or attention deficit disorder, ADD. Students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD, are 4.3 times more likely to experience maltreatment than students without disabilities, and are at a greater risk for potentially traumatic experiences. There are several factors contributing to this statistic, including deficits in language and an inability to provide verbal descriptions of his or her experiences and emotional states due to impairments in receptive and expressive language. These students may be at a greater risk for more intense stress response to traumatic events because of their neurobiological differences. These differences can also lead to more opportunities of being victimized due to stigmas of being vulnerable. For example, a student with IDD can sometimes be perceived as being more gullible or trusting of others. It's also important to note that students with disabilities are at a greater risk for trauma due to abuse by caregivers. One reason for this risk is explained by an increase in caregiver strain because students with disabilities require more care than those without disabilities, which can lead to an increase in stress. Now that we have a foundation of understanding on how trauma affects student behaviors and performances, let's dive a little deeper into the four main areas affected: social, emotional, academic, and behavior. Let's begin with how trauma can impact students socially. Social behavior challenges may include students who are defensive and argumentative with others. Students may be reluctant to share or have a difficult time taking turns, whether that be in a game or in conversation. They may also have a difficult time reading social cues from peers, teachers, and parents. Some students may even appear to be socially withdrawn or have a difficult time maintaining peer relationships. For example, often referred to as loners, these students may not interact with peers at recess, at lunch, or on the bus. They are typically quiet in the classroom and rarely speak up. Trauma can also affect students emotionally. For starters, students with a trauma history can have a difficult time identifying and expressing emotions. They may exhibit inconsistent moods and difficulty with self-regulation. You may notice that their reactions are not consistent with the size of the problems they face. For example, a student who loses their pencil may burst into tears and begin throwing things even though they have several others in their school box. Finally, Students may demonstrate emotional reactions that are manifested as worry or anxiety. This may look like a student crying or being socially withdrawn throughout the day. These behaviors are due to her worry of an upcoming test in PE. She has a history of being called a negative slur by her abusive father, and she's worried others will as well if she does not perform well. Behaviorally, trauma can present itself in many different forms. For example, you may notice students who have experienced trauma often demonstrate a lack of impulse control, demonstrate non-compliant or oppositional behaviors, emotional outbursts, tantrums, and may emotionally shut down, including outright withdrawal. Students with a history of trauma are also at a high risk of self-harming and suicidal ideation behavior. For example, Jenna is a junior who has lived with several friends, often moving from house to house every other day for the past 8 months. Jenna's parents were regularly emotionally abusive to her and decided to kick her out of the house because they did not support her choice to come out as gay. Before kicking her out of the house, Jenna's dad yelled awful homophobic slurs at her and told her he no longer has a daughter, and Jenna's reminded of her dad's words daily. Recently, Jenna started cutting herself because she said it gave her some release and a sense of control over her emotional pain. Jenna also recently shared with the school counselor that she even contemplated ending all the pain by taking her own life. Finally, let's talk about the behaviors students with a history of trauma may exhibit when it comes to academic needs. Students with trauma may have difficulty paying attention, have poor organizational skills, difficulty problem solving, as well as challenges with retaining information. For example, consider Ralphie, who has a history of trauma. When you walk in the classroom, you're quickly able to identify which desk is Ralphie's because his school box and books are scattered on top of his desk. There are also scraps of paper and broken crayons on the floor. The broken crayons and scraps of paper are the result of Ralphie's projects, while the teacher is providing verbal directions on how to complete tasks.